All right, we're in John 10 this morning. We're finishing up John 10. And, John gives us a lot of, we only get 7 miracles in John. We talked about that. John's a lot different gospel. We talked about that. No parables in John, no demon possessions in John, only 7 miracles in John. A lot of the I am statements in John, the divinity of Christ, we talk about that a lot in John's gospel. John is one way that we date how long Jesus' ministry was. And, it's in, of course, getting to my sermon a little bit, but it's only in John that we really get the Passover run, and of course one of them is a little debatable if that's a Passover or not. So we always take Jesus' ministry to be 3.5 years, or that's kind of the consensus. And that really comes out of John's gospel. So there's a lot in John that we get that we don't get anywhere else. And it kind of gives us some insight. We talked about the good sheep passage of the Bible quite a bit last week. And we get down into the bottom of that, the idea that he will lay down his life for the sheep. We talked about that last time, kind of looking ahead to the crucifixion, the idea that Jesus is the good shepherd. But he also brings in 16 that I have other sheep which are not of this fold. They'll become one flock with one shepherd. So Jesus looking towards the Gentiles here, looking towards bringing in the other sheep, the sheep that aren't Jews, sheep that aren't of this fold. The Father loves me because I lay down my life so I may take it up again. And this is very much looking towards the resurrection, looking towards the cross, the idea that Jesus has the authority to lay it down, and he has the authority to take it up. So he's going to do it willingly. He's going to have the authority to do it. He's a good shepherd. He lays down his life for the sheep. The sheep hear his voice. There's only one way into the fold. A lot of these lessons we get out of this passage of Scripture we talked about last Sunday morning. The idea, and it's really a very powerful analogy of what's going on as Jesus kind of begins to lay this down for us in John 10. The problem, well, not really the problem, but now we really reach, if you really look at John, of course I don't have this on the deal in front of you, but if you really look at John, we really have John chapter 2, that's the first Passover, okay? That's where he cleansed the temple in John's gospel. We talked about that early on and not towards the end. So we look at John 2, we're at the cleansing of the temple. And that would be the first Passover in John. And then if we move to John 7, we see the other feast here. So, and this is Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths in John 7. So it's not another Passover here in 7. But if you look at, I believe, my memory serves me right, if we look at John, finger's not working. At John 5, there's a feast of the Jews. So if you look at 2, it's the Passover for sure. If you look at the beginning of John 5, it's the healing at Bethesda, and there's a feast of the Jews, and they went up to Jerusalem. And then if you look at John 7, there's another feast of the Jews. So one of them is the Feast of Booths, Feast of Booths, Feast of Tabernacles. And then, so if you look, and that's probably John 5 is the Feast of Booths, Feast of Tabernacles. But if we look there, then that gives us 2 Passovers, and then we're going to have the last Passover that's fixing to happen. So it gives us 3 Passovers. Now the one, it doesn't say it's a Passover, it just says he went up to the feast in 7. So that's the debate. Is that a Passover? Is that not a Passover? See? And that's where a lot of people debate that, because there's a lot of Jewish feast days that aren't Passovers. So in John chapter 5, that's probably the Feast of Booths, and that happens in the fall. That happens this time of year. Matter of fact, I think I looked that up, and the Feast of Booths in Judaism this year is October 9th. So it's this time of year. So that would have been the fall of the year. And then Passover's in the spring of the year. So that brings us to 7 to the spring. So see, we're moving along pretty fast here. And if we take the feast in 7 to be a Passover, that's the second Passover. So we'd have had Passover in 2, Passover in 7, and then we have one more Passover coming at the end of John, which is going to be the crucifixion. So if you take John to be 3 Passovers, okay, then he started before that first Passover, right? Because he's baptized by John. They had the wedding, and he turned the water into wine in Cana and Galilee, right? So we had that, and then we had the first Passover, then we had the second Passover, then we had the third Passover. So if you take, now, no other gospel, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, doesn't give us that. Doesn't give us Passovers like that. They only give us one, okay? One. I've really been studying this. It's going to influence my sermon this morning, so you're kind of getting a preview of my sermon a little bit, because I really find it fascinating if we really start to track Jesus, where he went, how long he stayed, what he was doing when he went there. Because Jesus was in Galilee, right? Jesus come from Galilee. Nazareth is in Galilee. So Jesus was in Galilee, and Jesus began his ministry in Galilee, right? And the Sermon on the Mount's in Galilee, and a lot of the things that happen are in Galilee. But yet we spend a lot of the time in the Gospels and in John in Jerusalem. What happens in Jerusalem? We get a little bit in the middle. Samaritan woman, right? In between, going from Galilee to Judea. Go to Galilee to Judea. Jesus goes through Samaria. Most Jews go around the wilderness. Jesus goes through Samaria. So Jesus' life is encompassed in these areas. Galilee, Judea, and then a little bit in the middle, right? That's where Jesus lived. That's where he taught. That was it. I mean, that was the scope of his existence, was Galilee to Judea. That was it. So John spends a lot of time, the teaching, and we're just gonna, from here on out, we're gonna be at Jerusalem. But if you really study this, of course, I'm giving you a preview of my sermon, I guess, but if you really study this, there's only actually 7, if you put all the Gospels together, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's only actually 7 times that Jesus goes to Jerusalem in the Gospels. Just 7, which kind of surprised me. It kind of was surprising. I never really had studied that before. But anyway, and so as we get to the end, and the reason I'm bringing that up is we get to you'll see that in a minute as we get to the end of 10 and get into 11. A division occurred. He has a demon. In other words, saying there's not the sayings of a demon possessed. A demon cannot open the eyes of the blind. So we're looking plumb back to 9 now, right? Because isn't that what happened in 9? He healed the man born blind, remember? In 9. So we're going plumb back to 9 now. He can't heal one born blind. So this whole discourse of the shepherd, it all takes place within this context of the man born blind and Jesus teaching, and we're in Jerusalem, and he's doing this teaching, and he heals the man at the feast. And so it kind of ties it together. We believe this is the Feast of Booths, okay, here. It's also called Dedication of the Temple. It has to do with the Maccabean revolt. Dedication of the Temple, it's familiar to modern readers. It's Hanukkah, okay? So it's middle of December, Hanukkah. It's Festival of Lights. Prompt of the feast occurred in 164 BC when Judas Maccabeus consecrated the temple in Jerusalem had been defiled by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who sacrificed pigs on the altar. It's the 25th day of the 9th month, Keslev, were marked night by blazing lights and lanterns. Stories of brave opposition by the Maccabeans to the crushing forces of paganism were recounted, and the feast was one of praise to God for his marvelous deliverance of the Jews during the Maccabean period. So that's another one. So these festivals of the Jews. So Booths is the festival of harvest, okay? That's in the fall, October 9th this year. That's when the grapes came in, the olives came in, the harvest came in. They all made booths. They set them up. They were made out of fig trees and stuff, and they remembered that it was God's providence that gave them all that. So that's the Feast of Booths. Then you had Hanukkah, which would come out of the Maccabean revolt, right? You had Hanukkah. That was another celebration of the Jews. You had, there was one at the beginning too, beginning of harvest that you had. So there's 4, and then you had Passover. There's 4 major Jewish feasts, right? So when it says it was a feast of the Jews, well, you kind of got to try to figure out what feast we're talking about. It's not as simple as saying, well, that's Passover. We don't know that's Passover. So because we have these 4 feast days, so it makes it a little more difficult to figure out. But in John 10, it says this is the feast of dedication, and that's what I just told you about. So in John 10, so we looked at John 5, we looked at John 7, so let's not get confused. So John 2 was, we know that's Passover, it says Passover, right? John 2 is Passover. John 5 is probably Feast of Booths. That was the man born blind. John 7, right? Another Passover. Now we're in John 10. This is Hanukkah, what we call Hanukkah. So this is winter. So we've moved to winter. You see how John shifted us? So we were in there, the man born blind, Feast of Booths, right? 9, beginning of 10. Good Shepherd passage, right? We're in the spring, right? Or we're in the fall, right? Feast of Booths, October. We're in the fall. And now we get to the end of John 10, and then he says, and now it's the dedication, the Feast of Dedication. So now we're moved to December. Okay? Now we've moved into December. So we went from October, and now we're at the end of December. Here, that's the shift. We good? So time's progressing, okay? Time's progressing. So we're into October, right? And now we're looking pretty quickly. We're looking towards Passover again, right? Passover's coming in the spring, so we're pretty close, okay, to this. And it was winter, and they're in the same hemisphere as we are, so their winter is our winter. So it was winter, and Jesus was walking the temple, the portico of Solomon. The Jews gathered around him. How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. He says, I told you, you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, these testify of me. But you do not believe because you're not of my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. So John's tying it back in. Even though we've moved several months here, he's tying it back into this Good Shepherd passage. I've told you, right? My sheep know me. And he says to them, I give eternal life, and they'll never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one. So this is the reason John puts this in here, is because of what's going to happen later in John's gospel, right? When we get into John 13 and 14. So he's tying it in, this idea of I'm one, me and the Father's one. If you remember John 14, Philip says, they say, show us the way, right? And he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? And I don't know where you're going, right? And he says, show us the Father. Philip says to Jesus in John 14, show us the Father, and it's enough for us. And Jesus says, have I been with you so long, and yet you don't know me? If you know me, you know the Father. John repeatedly goes into this discourse. If you know Jesus, you know God. If I and the Father are one. But it's not just John that does that. It's throughout the entire Bible. You know, the Hebrew writer says that very thing in Hebrew 1, where he says that he's the exact representation of his being. It's Colossians 1, same idea that Paul brings up there. So the idea that if we see Jesus, we see God, that Jesus and God are one, and yet they're separate, and it's very confusing to us. But John more and more wants to show us the deity of Jesus, and that's how he does it. I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen God. We're the same. So John really pushes us in this direction. They wanted to stone him here. We begin to see the tide turn. They want to stone him. They wanted to kill him. But you got to remember, we're almost to the raising of Lazarus, and Lazarus is the turning point in John's gospel. In the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the turning point is the cleansing of the temple. When Jesus cleanses the temple, they turn against him. They want to kill him. In John's gospel, it's the raising of Lazarus. When Lazarus is raised, then they plot to kill Jesus. Cleansing of the temple, beginning of John's gospel, right? End of the synoptic gospels. So a lot of stuff to process here, trying to tie all this together. A lot of things to think about as John moves us to this point, because John's going to spend so much time at the end of Jesus' life here. So a lot of things to process as we move through John's gospel. A lot of things to process. For a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. Not a God, right? You make yourself out to be God. God, Jehovah God. So to them that was blasphemy, because he said, I am the Father and the Father is me. You know, that's the blasphemy, and that's what they're going to hold up to him at the crucifixion. So things are moving that way. He says, is it not written in your law, I said you are gods? And if he called them gods, to whom the word of God came, do you say of him who the Father sanctified, sent into the world, you are blaspheming, because I said I am the Son of God? If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. It's a play on words, and it's an Old Testament idea. You are gods. Gods in the non-capitalized form. Not God, but gods. Jesus is kind of playing it against them. I know it's kind of confusing here what Jesus is doing. He's kind of playing this against them. Has it not been written in your law, I said you are gods? And if he's called them gods to whom the word of God came, do you say of him who the Father sanctified and sent into the world, you are blaspheming, because I said I am the Son of God? It's a play. It's just a play on words, but it doesn't really do anything to help them, because the idea of saying you are gods, or not God, but gods, is not the same idea as saying I am God. And Jesus is basically saying, you know, I am God. Not gods, not in the small sense, but I am God, God himself, God Jehovah. You know, in the Greek, we don't get that differentiation in the words. In the Greek, the word God, Elohim, in the Greek. Now, if we go to the Hebrew, there's a lot of different words for God in the Hebrew. So, I mean, not Elohim in the Greek. Mine's not working. Theos. So if we go Theos in the Greek, in the Hebrew, it's Elohim, or it can be Lord, Adonai, or it can be Jehovah, right? YHWH, tetragrammatons. There's different words for God in the Hebrew, but not in the Greek. So not so much in the Greek. So it kind of is a play on words, a play on thought. But it doesn't negate the fact that Jesus is saying, or Jesus saying, I am God himself. I am God. So, you know, why didn't they kill him here? Why didn't they stone him? Because he's still popular at this point, right? There's still a lot of people rallied around him. He's still popular. They're really not permitted to put people to death. But they wanted to. They wanted to pick up stones. They wanted to stone him. If you do them, it says, you do not believe me. But if I do them, the works, though you do not believe me, believe the works, so that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I in the Father. They were seeking again to seize him. He eluded their grasp and went away again beyond the Jordan to the place where John was first baptizing, and he was staying there. So he goes out now into the wilderness. Like I say, he's always in this region of the world, right? Very small geographic region of the world. So he goes back into the wilderness. So we've moved through a lot of time here, almost 3 years. When we get into 11, it says, many came to him, were saying, while John performed no sign, yet everything John said about this man was true. Many believed in him there, it says. But if we get into 11, we shift gears again. So we were in December, right? We were in December, and now we're right at Passover. So we went to where John was staying, so we're going to lose about, 3 or 4 months in here, 5 months in here of his life. We don't know what happened here. And we're going to go back to Bethany now. Lazarus, which is in Bethany, which is just outside of Jerusalem, not very far outside of Jerusalem. So John's moving us forward here in time. And it was Lazarus, and we know about Lazarus. We know about Mary. We know about Martha. We know Jesus stayed there. Jesus more than stayed there. Jesus was really friends with them. Do you see that in the Bible? He liked to go there. I mean, that was some place he went. He stayed. He liked to go there, right? Martha fed him. Mary anointed his feet. I mean, it was a good place to go, right? I mean, Jesus really didn't have a home, right? As far as we know. He had no home. He had no place that was his. He just stayed wherever. A lot of times it looks like they stayed outside. If you really read the Gospel, sometimes stayed in the garden, sometimes slept outside. It looks like they did that a lot. So it was a big thing to have some place to go. This is close to Bethany. It's close to Jerusalem. Easy walk. And Jesus is going to go back and forth there through this in this week of atonement. He's going to go back to Bethany, back to Jerusalem. So it's close. He's comfortable there. He knows these people. He's friends with these people. But once again, we've separated him off. And now we get to this point, Lazarus was sick, right? The Mary who anointed the Lord's with ointment, wiped his feet with her hair. His brother Lazarus was sick. So the sister sent word to him. You know, as far as we know, they're not married, right? As far as we know, they're not married. Martha and Mary are really interesting in the Bible because, you know, Lazarus is always kind of mentioned almost as an afterthought, right? It's always Mary and Martha, then Lazarus, right? Even though he was the man of the house, and in that culture, that should have made him the prominent one. Women, as we know in that culture, weren't really allowed ownership, weren't really allowed property, weren't really allowed status. And yet it appears Mary and Martha had all of those things. They were apparently well off. They had their own house. They were able to entertain Jesus. Another reason we can say they're well off is when Lazarus died, there were a whole lot of Jews there to lament. And generally that only happened to wealthy people, to have a lot of Jews to lament. That generally happened to wealthy people. So there's a lot of indication they were fairly well off. And Jesus, I think it's fascinating that Jesus, you know, I think Jesus did more for the rights of women than maybe any other figure in history, realistically. I mean, that was such a culture that women didn't have voice, and yet Jesus' ministry was surrounded by women, wasn't it? Supported by women. Women followed him to the tomb. Mary and Martha, the relationship he had with them, the relationship you see with his mother throughout the Gospels. It was amazing that way, and we really start to get but he had a closeness to them. He had a closeness to this family. This was more than just somebody. This was somebody that Jesus really loved and cared about on a personal level. And so it's interesting, and there's a lot in this story. The one whom you love is sick. Isn't it interesting in 3? He didn't say Lazarus was sick. Did you notice that? It says the one whom you love is sick. I think we miss that sometimes. He knew who he was, right? Apparently Jesus loved Lazarus. They had a relationship. So, you know, they were two people that knew each other and loved each other. And Jesus heard this. He said it won't end in death. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So John kind of puts in there, you know, he loved them all, right? He loved people. He loved mankind. But this gives you an idea of the humanity of Christ. He loved them individually. He loved them as people because they took care of him. He stayed there. He had a relationship with them. And I just find that really neat because you don't see that much in Jesus' life. The relationships he had were mostly with the apostles, it looks like. And you just don't get much of a view into his personal the people that was close to him. We talk about Mary Magdalene. We make a lot out of Mary Magdalene. We know almost nothing about Mary Magdalene, really. Almost nothing. But, here we have Mary and Martha and Lazarus, who we do know something about, and we know his relationship with them. We know that he loved them. We know that when he was sick, they looked towards Jesus to do it. But he stays, right? And when he heard he was sick, he then stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Well, it just said he went out into the Jordan. He went out into the wilderness, right? We just saw that. Now, whether or not that's where he was now, I don't know, but it kind of gives that impression. He kind of went out by himself, went out into the wilderness, went out away from everybody. He was not where they could put their hands upon him. They were seeking to, we saw that at the end of that, they're seeking to kill him. He escaped out of their grasp. We saw that at the end of 10. So now we're here in 11. We're here, and this is going to happen. And the disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you're going there again? So in other words, we get the idea he hadn't been back to Jerusalem in this time period. He had been out in the wilderness doing what he was doing out there. He had never returned back into Jerusalem because they were seeking to kill him. And Jesus said, are not 12 hours a day? If anyone walks in the day, does not stumble because he sees the light of the world. In other words, he's saying, you need to trust me on this. Because John always says, Jesus is light. He says there's 12 hours in the day. You need to trust me. We're going back to Judea. Probably the fascinating idea in here is when he gets into 11, he said, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so I may awaken him out of sleep. And the disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he'll recover. But Jesus spoken of his death. They thought he was speaking of literal sleep. And Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go. So Jesus knew the whole time what was going on, and he delayed purposefully, right? He wanted Lazarus to be dead. Yep, I got that right. He wanted Lazarus to be dead, right? And he wanted him to be dead a while. This is a big miracle. Question, why is it not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke? I mean, this seems like a big one to me. This seems like, if you're going to put miracles on a scale, raising a Lazarus has got to be, I don't know, got to be top 3, doesn't it? I think. I don't know, what was Jesus' greatest miracle, do you think? Like this was it? Is this number 1 if we had to rank miracles? If we voted on great miracles, would this be number 1, you think? Came back to life, the resurrection. Yeah, that was a big one. Feeding of the multitude, healing of the blind. He raised the widow's son back to life, right? So this is the first time he's raised somebody from the dead. Difference between the widow's son and Lazarus, though, what's the difference between those two raising of the dead? Time frame, right? Widow's son had just died. Lazarus is going to be dead a while. You don't think like calming the sea was a bigger miracle than raising Lazarus? I don't know how you rank them for sure. I don't know how you do that, but Lazarus is big. So why is it not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke? I have a theory, but it's only a theory. So my theory is that this might not be a good theory, but I'll share it with you. My theory is that it was such a big thing. It has to do with the dating of John. This is my hypothesis. John's real late. Like this gospel is late. Like this gospel could be in the 90 ADs, right? Realistically, this gospel could have been written in the 90 ADs. John's gospel was probably written after 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, right? So this gospel is really late. So you got, I know when you read your Bible, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John are at the end, but you need to get that out of your mind because that's because they're short. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were probably written first, and the Gospel of John was written after that, then Revelation. Revelation was written really, really, really late, like late 90s, like maybe 99 AD, I think, really late. Now, there's arguments about that, of course, because a lot of people think, like Foy Wallace, is about the destruction of Jerusalem. It's it had been written 471 AD, but I think that doesn't hold water. So I think Revelation's in the 90s, and I think John's written in the 90 ADs. Now, the other Gospels were written in the 60s, okay, like 63, 65 AD. So let's say there's 30 years pass between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Now, my hypothesis about a lot of things in John is that this was so big that they didn't need to mention it. Everybody knew it. That's kind of my theory. It's like this was so big that when Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote, it's like everybody knows that. This is like the big thing. Everybody knows this, right? Because let's face it, or this is what I think. And I know the Bible's inspired by the Holy Spirit. I know the whole argument. I know all that. But with that in mind, they're still written by individuals, and we see their personality and what they're doing as we read what they write. I believe with all my heart that if you had went back to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and Peter, and everybody else that wrote the Bible, Luke, and whoever wrote Hebrews, if you go back to all those people and say, listen, 2,000 years from now, people are going to be reading this, I think they would have made it longer. Just my thought. I think they would have maybe made it a little bit longer. I really don't think anybody, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I really don't believe those guys. I think if you would have told them 2,000 years later people are going to be reading this, I think they would have said, yeah, there's no way that's going to happen. I mean, that's just how I get it. And maybe that's not the way to look at it, but I just think that's why it's not there. I think this was such a big deal that when Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote, they're like, everybody knows that. Right? Yeah. There's a good, because if you read John's gospel, well, we'll get into that, it says they wanted to kill them both. They wanted to kill Lazarus and Jesus, right? I mean, the best way to get rid of the proof of this miracle is destroy the evidence, right? So if we kill Lazarus, then, there's a lot of things about this miracle. You would like, okay, so I'll throw this one out. Y'all can think about this week. So we have all these people now that we have these near-death experiences, right? We've all seen, and there's even written, one guy wrote a book, right? Like 90 minutes. I forget the name of it. Anyway, but, a lot of people who think that we believe in soul sleep, believe that the soul sleeps after death, Lazarus is a really big, they use him as an example in that because they say, okay, listen. So if Lazarus was really dead for 3 whole days, right? Then why didn't he tell us what happened while he was dead? Right? In other words, why don't we know? Why didn't Lazarus say what happened while he was dead? Well, he might have, realistically. He might have told people what happened when he was dead. John chose not to tell us, obviously, right? That it doesn't mean that Lazarus didn't say something. Anyway, I just think that's kind of an interesting thought. Lazarus could have wrote a really good book. I mean, 3 days in the tomb, right? I mean, it would have been a bestseller. So, but he didn't, we don't know what happened to him in that time, right? In Jewish thought, the soul stayed with the body for 3 days. That was like Jewish thought. So when you died, the soul stayed with the body for 3 days, and then the soul departed the body. So that's why Jesus wanted him to be in the tomb for 3 days. But with that in mind, isn't it interesting that Jesus' body was also in the tomb for 3 days, right? Yes, because they would think the soul had departed the body. It was truly a resurrection. So there's a similarity here as John works towards Jesus. There's a parallel here between Lazarus in the tomb for 3 days, Jesus in the tomb for 3 days, and then what did Jesus say? He said, the only sign I'll be giving you is the sign of Jonah, that as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, right? So there's a lot of stuff, parallels, a lot of things going on here to think about, a lot of it that ties together. He goes, I love 16. Okay, so think about this. So only in John's gospel did we get doubting Thomas, right? Doubting Thomas is not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Remember, we always talk about doubting Thomas. Put your hand in my, feel my hands, put your hand in my side, right? Unless I touch him, I won't believe. We always call him doubting Thomas. That's just a terrible thing because, you know, they all doubted. We don't say all them doubting apostles. We just say doubting Thomas. But the reason we have Thomas, we'll get into that when we get to Thomas. I'm not going to go ahead of myself. But it's fascinating that it's here and I think John did this to redeem Thomas. I always thought this was Thomas's redemption. You know, he's going to blast Thomas for not believing that Jesus is the Christ. He's going to kind of blast him for that, you know. Unless I feel his hands and put my hand in his side, I'm not going to believe it's him, right? And he kind of blasts him, but we never look at this. And I think this was John's way of redeeming Thomas, you know. That's what I think. I think Thomas deserves a little redemption, right? And I think this was where John redeemed him, where he said, Thomas, right, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go so that we may die with him. And I just love that because, you know, we always talk about doubting Thomas, don't we? And that's his moniker, right? Doubting Thomas, just like Judas, the one that betrayed him. That's his moniker. But what about brave Thomas? You know, why don't we call him brave Thomas? He's the one that said, let's go back so that we can die with him. I mean, I think I'd rather be brave Thomas than doubting Thomas, but I mean, all of them doubted, right? But only Thomas here was brave enough to say, let's go so that we can die with him. So next time somebody says doubting Thomas, just think in your mind, well, he was kind of brave too, wasn't he? I mean, Thomas wasn't a bad guy. He doubted like they all doubted, like we would have doubted. But look at him here. He's brave. He's ready to go die with Jesus, ready to go die with him. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. We'll get more into Lazarus next time. Thank you for your attention this morning.